Good morning, Year 10, and welcome back to the UK's Human Landscape. Today we are looking at employment and how it has changed in the UK over time, and also how it changes according to the area that you are living in. So this is sort of employment opportunities, this is the types of jobs that we would attempt to do, and perhaps what kind of influence that has on income levels, education levels, and migration as well. These things are going to tie in throughout the entire unit, so obviously this isn't something we can look at just in isolation. We will mention employment again, but today is that kind of overview. Now, one of the only changes I'm making today is just to do your homework review at the end of the lesson. So last lesson, I started the lesson with the homework review. This lesson, we're still looking at your homework, but we will do it at the end of the lesson. Okay, let's get started. The types of jobs that people do to earn income or to earn a living. So employment has changed quite a lot in the UK, and when we say that, we mean over a period of time stretching probably back about 70 or 80 years, okay? So this is quite a long period of time, but it has made a significant difference to communities and livelihoods around the UK. So we're going to start off with 3 short questions. What do you think we mean by a deprived area? So what does an area that is deprived look like? What characteristics does it have? I'd also like you to write for me, please, a definition of deprivation. What does it mean to be deprived? What is deprivation? Okay, so perhaps you might feel confident telling me what a deprived area looks like, maybe what it has, what it doesn't have, but defining deprivation is a bit harder for you perhaps. And finally then, a bit of recap. We've done this a lot in Key Stage 3, but it's a really, really important sort of foundational piece of geographical knowledge. The 4 sectors of the economy, what are they? What names do we give them? And can you give me an example of a job for each of those sectors? Just pause the video now and do that starter for me, please. A deprived area is usually in a developed nation. In this particular context, we're talking about deprivation in the UK. And it's an area where there's high unemployment and high crime, and possibly or probably poor health and education services, lack of access to housing, perhaps the housing is unaffordable. Now, we can talk about deprivation in the UK, but deprivation is quite a relative thing. It's similar to inequality. It's where some people don't have as much as others. But it also refers to a sort of damaging lack of these things. So it's not to say that you're just poor, but that you are so poor that it causes issues with health, education, crime, unemployment, and the rest. So it's a damaging lack of things which are considered to be basic necessities in a society. For example, access to education, healthcare, or wages that are high enough to live on. When we say wages that are high enough to live on, sometimes in the UK we're talking about something called the living wage. We might also be thinking about a minimum wage, and those are not the exact same thing. A minimum wage is the legal minimum amount that you're allowed to pay somebody. A living wage is generally the calculation of how much you would need to be paid to have a normal life in that country. So, question 3, the 4 sectors of the economy. I really, really hope lots of you got this right because we have done it before. It is starting off then with primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So the primary industries extract more materials directly from the earth or sea. Give me a job example of somebody that does that, please. Hopefully you said something like farming, fishing, logging, even mining. Okay, so this particular image here is actually of an oil well, a pump that is drawing out oil from the depths of the earth. Our secondary industry then is all about processing that. It's manufacturing products from raw materials, and you'd be surprised at how many things fall under the secondary industry. Bricklaying or baking for sort of loaves that end up in your supermarket. Your tertiary services are pretty much the largest sector in the UK. Services, again, are a very, very broad category. This is the 3rd sector where we are talking about providing people with something that isn't as tangible as a raw material. It's not something that you can necessarily hold, touch, and feel. So it is something that is often considered the knowledge economy. Okay, not always, but very often the knowledge economy is part of providing tertiary services. Let's have a think about some jobs that count as providing tertiary services. It might be something like being a bus driver, working in a supermarket, but equally being a nurse or a doctor. Even what I do as a service, you don't leave this with anything physical that you can hold, but hopefully you leave school and my lessons with plenty of knowledge that are going to enable you to do other things. Finally then, we have our quaternary sector, and this is the one that people most often struggle to define what it does. The quaternary sector is all about the creation and invention and innovation of new things. Let's say, for instance, back in the Industrial Revolution, the creation of automobiles was part of the quaternary sector. Now, of course, the manufacture of automobiles comes back under this secondary sector. Are there any parts of the car industry or the automobile industry that still fall under quaternary? Of course. Someone like Tesla arguably straddles both the secondary because they produce and manufacture and sell electric cars, but also they fall under quaternary because they're still doing research into how to make those cars more efficient, how to improve the technology that we are provided with in order to improve our world. So another quite topical example is, of course, the huge amount of investment that's going currently into developing a vaccine for the COVID-19 virus. All of the people that are working on that are working within our quaternary industry. So, looking at how this changes over time then, we're moving on to our first task. Here is a model. It's a graph, but it's still a model because it isn't plotted on exact data. It's showing you the overall trend in the changing employment structure of the UK. And what we can see is in our pre-industrial period in 1800, we have very high numbers of, or high percentages of people who work in primary industries, fishing, farming, mining, as we've discussed. Relatively low numbers of people working in tertiary services and sort of middling numbers of people working in secondary services. As the Industrial Revolution moves on then, you should probably already know from Key Stage 3 history that many people migrated from the countryside to the cities. And some of the reasons behind that, we generally catch up in a term, which is industrialization. And we moved ourselves into this industrial phase. In the industrial phase, that meant a huge amount of mechanization, so using machines to do the tasks of workers or the jobs that people had done before. So for example, in farming, instead of cutting all of the crops by hand, you might send out a machine like a thresher to go and cut the crops much quicker, doing the work of many people in the same amount of time. So that reduced the number of people who needed to work in these primary industries. In the meantime, development and innovation in the industrial sector, in our manufacturing sector, for instance, steelworks, energy production, cloth and fabric production, amongst plenty of other industries, would have grown, and they grew very rapidly. And so this is your kind of height of the Industrial Revolution over here. Alongside this then, there come a huge number of services. Let's say, for instance, workers who need to buy lunch when they're having lunch break from their factories require people who are going to be providing the service of preparing those lunches, okay? It might equally be laundry services that are required. It might be cleaning services that are required. It might be accounting and finance services that are suddenly required by these growing businesses. There are loads of different things that fall under this tertiary sector, and many of you will all end up with jobs in the tertiary sector. Eventually, though, we see this fall in the secondary sector of our economy, and this is a kind of period of deindustrialization. So here we have industrialization as it grows, and as it falls, it's deindustrialization. And deindustrialization has a huge impact on the UK and its employment structure. Okay. All this time, however, we've seen these primary products, these primary industries falling in the percentage of people working in them. Okay, again, showing us how efficient those industries have become. But it also might show us something else. The decline in both the primary and the secondary sector is also due to the fact that a lot of our jobs have gone overseas. A lot of the things that people used to do in the UK, particularly in manufacturing, are not taking place in the UK any longer. just have a think ahead for me. Whereabouts in the world do you think that those jobs are now taking place? Finally, let's have a little look at our Quaternary sector. Now, it really doesn't emerge until after the industrial period, and I want you to see if you can figure out why. Okay, what is it about our Quaternary, our innovation and research sector of the economy that we're saying really only emerges sort of in the late 1980s? What key things could have been invented around that time that would have enabled the development of our Quaternary services? Okay, maybe actually it's not fair of me to say this is sort of 1980. I think this is probably closer to sort of 1940. Yeah, if we want to think about sort of strong advances in medicine, chemical engineering, that kind of thing. So what I'd like you to do now is to watch this video here carefully. You can click on it directly in here and it should play within there. It is a clip from the history section of BBC Teach, but it is really relevant to the UK's industrial past. This video is explaining a little bit more about what I explained in terms of the UK's industrial revolution that we just saw in the last graph. And your second task is please to make a note, just a sentence or two for each of them, about what changed in terms of migration, what changed in terms of population numbers, types of jobs, manufacturing, the environment specifically, and politics over this period of time. Now, it isn't going to take very much, and we've discussed some of these things already, but this is a really good way to consolidate your knowledge. It has a particular focus on the development of locomotives and of the rail and transport network in the UK. For those of you that know me well, you'll be familiar with the fact that one of my favourite key terms in geography is infrastructure, and locomotives or the train network are a key part of Britain's infrastructure network in terms of transport that enabled the Industrial Revolution to take off so dramatically. Now that you're done with that, let's have a look at task 3. On your worksheet, you have a long list of points, and what I would like you to do is to sort them into the two sections or two sides of this table. So these are the same things that you've got, and let's just talk about a couple of them. We'll start off with my two examples. The first column asks you about the reasons for the primary and secondary industries, so that's extraction of raw materials and manufacturing industries, that have declined in the United Kingdom. And secondly, on the right, our column says, why have we had a growth in the tertiary and quaternary industries in the United Kingdom? Okay, now to start us off then, an increase in the number of trade unions and demand for better paying conditions. For those of you that do history and sociology, this is a really, really interesting point. It has a lot linked up with the Industrial Revolution, with our post-war politics, so post-Second World War politics. And trade unions are basically a way of people collectively together demanding better treatment. Now, that is in and of itself a good thing, but it can increase costs for firms. So let's say, for instance, you work down a coal mine. Working down a coal mine is incredibly dangerous. It has a lot of health hazards. It can shorten your life expectancy. It's very difficult, hard work. And in order to sort of improve the conditions of the people working down the mines, they kind of got together and said, we will not work unless you improve our conditions. Now, there will have been some improvements that were made in terms of the conditions, but in order to make those improvements, it would have cost the companies who were producing coal, who were using those people to produce coal, quite a lot of money. And because of that higher pay and better working conditions, the cost of employing people to dig for coal in the United Kingdom also went up. On the other hand, where in the world do you think it is cheap still to ask people to do dangerous jobs without proper safety precautions that have a large impact on their health and well-being, and they still are willing to do that for relatively low pay? Okay, so that is a reason that in the UK those jobs have declined. That doesn't mean that they're disappeared. They still exist, but they just don't exist here in the UK as much as they used to. Of course, a growth in tertiary and quaternary industries can partly be linked to the fact that there was a declining number of primary and secondary jobs. People had to go out and find alternative things to do. Okay. Looking down here then, these things are the ones I want you to put into the right categories. Some of them perhaps you may not be super familiar with. Globalization is a huge key concept, and we're looking at that mostly next lesson, but it refers to the increased integration and connectivity of different places around the world. Okay, perhaps the invention of the World Wide Web, something that I was hinting at back when we were looking at task 1. Okay. Education levels increasing. Does improved education make you more likely to want to go into a job in services and research, or does it make you more likely to want to go into a job that is about extracting and manufacturing materials? Okay. Pause the video, have a go at this task for me, please. If you get it wrong, you can always correct it. Don't worry. Okay, so let's have a look at some of those answers. Get a green pen out for me, please. And we're going to have a little look. So, on the left, the reasons for my decline. Okay, we've discussed mechanization. So the decline in the number of people working in farms is because machines are able to do it faster. Okay, perhaps more efficiently, perhaps cheaper in the long run. Perhaps the fact that there is limited space for farming. At a certain point, you can't grow anymore. And this is what leads to things like intensive farming. Cheaper wages abroad. And we've just mentioned this when we were thinking about coal mining. But this is true not just of coal mining, but also things like garment manufacturing, making clothes, manufacturing sort of plastic products. Steel manufacture is a massive one. There's lots and lots of those things. The rise of clean jobs is almost like a positive thing that declines the primary and secondary sector. People, if they're given the choice of working in an office or working hard in a field, often choose to work in an office. So this sort of rise in clean jobs draws people away from those primary and secondary jobs. Over here then, we've got things like working from home. Right now, I'm working from home. It's not something I ever thought would be possible in terms of teaching in a practical way, but this is only possible because of the growth of tertiary and quaternary industries. If I was physically making something, working from home would be much, much more difficult. But since I'm just providing you with information and I have the technology, particularly the next point, the invention of the World Wide Web, I have the technology, I can provide you with those same services, my knowledge and skill in teaching with you at home. So, thinking about different regions of the UK, what do you already know about the northeast of England? If you are amongst my students at Preston Manor, then we may not have a huge amount of experience with the northeast of England. It's quite a long way away. Maybe we know that they have different accents to us. Maybe we know that things are sometimes cheaper in the northeast, particularly say houses. But what else do we know about it? Have a little look at the types of images here, and what does it make you think about in terms of the types of industries that are pictured here, the types of employment that would be required, or the skills that are required from these industries. So starting over here then, this is the Angel of the North. It's a big symbol up north. It's just outside of Newcastle. And it's made of iron or steel, and it's a reference to the area's industrial past. Okay, up here Nissan still have factories up in the northeast. Okay, but in the past it wouldn't just have been things like car manufacturing at the sort of far end of the supply chain, but it would have also been things like steel manufacture. This down here is a picture of a man working in a coal mine, and that coal mine, as you can tell, is quite closed. He doesn't have a huge amount of protective gear apart from a small lamp. He doesn't even have a helmet on, and I don't know if you can tell, but he is working with just this wooden strut to support him. There's a pool of water here. You can tell that this is not a sort of modern, safe, health and safety kind of working environment. In contrast then, the southeast of England, and particularly London and its surrounding areas, have quite a different spread of jobs. Up here, I have an image of Canary Wharf. This is London's financial district. Okay, when you watch the beginning of EastEnders, it does appear just there next to the O2. just on the other side of that loop, that meander that we see on London's overview. The southeast has a very different landscape in many ways. It's a lot lower lying, it's a lot flatter. This is something that we've discussed quite a lot in the UK's physical landscape. But of course, the way the land is physically has an impact on what we use it for as humans. And so much of the southeast's rolling fields are used exactly for that, for farming. Okay, and this is something again that we mentioned last lesson when we said, where do people actually live? What kinds of things do they do? And if you recall, there was a map that showed that although we live on only about 7% of the UK's landmass, we use over 80% of it for agriculture. Okay, down here I have my Quaternary sector. Okay, this one here is a signpost, maybe not so obvious. I was thinking about tourism there. So, why am I showing you the contrast between the different areas of the country? Well, here's something that we have known for quite a long time. There is what we consider a North-South divide in the UK. And when we refer to the North-South divide, we can refer to it in both its real sense, based on data, and also its imagined or perceived cultural and economic differences. So you can have this sort of sense that things are unfair. People perceive Londoners or people in the southeast to be wealthy, rich, snobs, or what have you. That doesn't mean it applies to everyone, as we well know. Not everyone in the southeast is wealthy at all, but that doesn't mean that there aren't real differences in the average levels of income and the average wealth and provision of services that are available in the southeast compared to the north. Okay, so in particular, this is a product of deindustrialization. I don't ever want you to get the impression that the north of England has always been poor. It hasn't. For a very long time, and particularly during the UK's industrial past, it was the powerhouse of the UK economy. But deindustrialization, the reduction in the number of factories, the reduction in secondary and primary employment, as we've already mentioned, caused major unemployment, and it particularly impacted the north. So, although during the Industrial Revolution, the UK's growth was centred in the coalfields of Wales, northern England, cities such as Manchester that used to thrive now unfortunately have relatively high unemployment. Now, that isn't static. It isn't always going to be the case. Manchester is the UK's second city in many ways. The BBC have big offices up there and production studios and all kinds of things. Lots and lots of firms do have bases in Manchester, and it is growing as a site for tertiary employment. But it is still poor by comparison to London. Okay, so at the same time as there is deindustrialization and decline in the north, the southeast developed rapidly due to its fast-growing service sector. In particular, something that we've mentioned before and we will continue to mention is London's major financial centre. But you must remember that although London has a major financial centre, because of all those people working in offices, there are loads of other industries that have grown up around that too. Think about all the restaurants and bars, the gyms that office workers go to, and of course, all of the cleaning services, laundry services, hotels for visitors, all of that stuff comes under our service sector. So having a major financial centre is important, but it isn't the only industry in London. What could be said is that other sectors depend on the financial sector to keep it going. So, task 4 then. In your own words, please, what is the UK's North-South divide? I want you to explain that concept, please. In your own words, it should be a peel paragraph, please. Make the point, explain it. Give an example, link it to something else. In particular, you could link it to deindustrialization. Okay? Off you go. More on the North-South divide. This infographic is a little bit old, but it really helps to exemplify and give some evidence about the impacts of the North-South divide. Okay, now it is, as I said, a bit old. The phrase on the left here says the recession is widening the gap between the South and the North, but I did think it was relevant, not only because our last recession in around 2013, okay, which is when this graphic was made, did increase the differences in terms of the disadvantaged and the advantaged. Our deprived areas became poorer, and unfortunately the rich became richer. There is a possibility that that is going to happen again, okay? It's a real concern for me, but it should be a concern for the whole country and for the government, okay? I don't think that it is necessarily fair, but it's an almost inevitable outcome of our sort of current crisis, is that the difference between sort of the wealthy southeast and the poorer northwest, or the outcomes for those people who are living a more deprived life compared to a more privileged life, is going to be different. Let's have a look at some of those outcomes then. So for instance, Liverpool's life expectancy is almost 4 years less than Cambridge. That means that people on average in Liverpool are expected to live shorter lives because of their lower levels of health, perhaps their lower levels of wealth or education. If we were even to think about how much focus these places get, government spending per person in London is over £9,000, whereas in Yorkshire and the East Midlands, we see that government spending per person per year is quite a lot lower, okay? So let's have a think about the similarities and differences. We're comparing now the North and the Southeast. Okay, now what I would like you to do is a Venn diagram. Normally when we do a Venn diagram, you write the statements into the right spaces, but it's really hard to do on a digital worksheet. So I'm going to ask you to do the Venn diagram by color coding. If the statement applies to Northern England, I want you to color code it yellow. If it applies to the southeast of England, then color code it in red for me, please. But if the statement applies to both, and there will be some of those, can you please make sure that it is in orange? As a challenge, from all the things that we've discussed, are you able to add 3 of your own statements to our Venn diagram? Again, color code them, tell me where they belong. Maybe you can think of a statement for all 3 categories. Perhaps you can think of, actually this I think would be quite difficult, of a statement that applies to both categories, 3 statements that apply to both, please. Pause the video, off you go. So, we're going to do our plenary, and then we are going to mark our homework. Just like I said at the beginning of the lesson, I've moved the marking of our homework to the end just to keep the flow going a bit. So just before we finish the focus of today's lesson, I want to ask you, do you think the UK government should invest in all regions equally? Is it right that they're doing this, investing more in London than they are elsewhere? Do they have some justifications for this? A large portion of the UK's population does live in London. We've already said that it's an urban core and that it generates a disproportionate amount of the UK's GDP or wealth. So is it right? Is it fair? Should we be investing more in less well-off regions? What kinds of investments would we like to see in those places? What could we spend money on that would be really, really helpful? And is it right that we concentrate on the wealthier regions because they do generate more of an income? GNI is our gross national income for the country as a whole. Okay, so let's have a look at your homework. Could you get your homework out, please, and a green pen? You could be opening it up from the digital version that I posted on your Google Classroom, but whatever you do as we go, I want you to improve your work. Now, if you didn't attempt it fully, or you haven't tried it at all, pause the video, go back and do your homework. This explanation will help to correct it, but it isn't going to tell you every single answer. And in fact, having done this lesson beforehand probably will help you with this homework. So, there were 2 sheets in your homework. The first sheet was looking at the decline of the UK's older economy, so that deindustrialization. And I wanted you to tell me which industries thrived in the Northeast in the past, being as detailed as possible and using evidence to support your points. So we've got the primary sector, including farming. We should also have, of course, the secondary sector, and we can give really specific examples of the secondary sector. For example, somewhere that we looked at, like Sheffield, had a big steelworks. Liverpool had large dockyards, so they used to build ships, a lot of ships. Compare the employment changes in Dinnington, and that Dinnington case study is in your textbook. It's the caboodle one on pages 170. So what were the employment changes in Dinnington before the mines were closed compared with now? So what we're kind of saying is, in a place that used to have a large number of coal mines, for example, Dinnington, what kind of skills were needed, what kind of work would people do? And let's have a little look at that. So the level of skill needed to be a coal miner. Well, you did have to have training. It's not a completely unskilled profession. But did you need to go to university to work down the coal mines? No. The answer is that many young people left school a lot earlier than you would be allowed to now in order to go and get a job down the coal mines. It was just what they did. It's what their parents and their grandparents did before them. It was often full-time work. And that's really important. If you work full-time, even if you're on a low pay, you potentially have enough money to make ends meet, to be able to afford the cost of living. One of our big problems with the modern UK economy is something that we sometimes call the gig economy, where, say for instance, if you work for Deliveroo or Uber, you work part-time whenever they can give you a job, but you're not guaranteed an income. And that is a really, really difficult and uncertain way of living. Is the job temporary or permanent? Well, many coal miners would have said the job was permanent. And normally I think we would say that. They didn't last forever. The coal mines did close down, and so those jobs have disappeared. But if we want to think about things like temporary jobs, seasonal farming work is a temporary job. Perhaps working over the Christmas sales is a temporary job. Okay, so in this case, comparing the employment, it used to be permanent jobs, and now a lot of the work that's available will be temporary. Okay. The level of income, before many were well paid, now many are low paid. That is kind of what we're saying. Mining was a relatively well paid job at the time, okay, partly, as we've already mentioned, because of the power of the unions to agree collectively and to lobby collectively for their rights and their pay. Unfortunately, unions have declined in the UK. They've got less power now, less political influence, and so their ability to negotiate for higher pay is very, very challenging. In particular, again, the Uber example, Uber drivers, technically, they work for themselves. They don't even work for Uber directly, which means that they don't get things like sick pay, holiday benefits. They don't get necessarily guarantees on their working conditions. So these are real issues. And in fact, some Uber drivers have been taking Uber to court over the fact that they consider them to have been breaching employment regulations in the UK. This last one's an interesting one. Did the jobs previously benefit men or women more? And it is a matter of debate as to whether or not the current temporary or gig economy suits men or women more. It's hard to say that. But certainly with the previous coal mining, that was much better suited to men, okay, because it was physical, back-breaking labour. There are elements of, social changes and expectations that have altered over time, okay, but in particular, it used to benefit men more. Often now, though, our part-time, low-paid workers are women. A lot of people who might work, say, for instance, in a supermarket, a lot of people who do piecework, who do childcare or nannying or cleaning, a lot of that work is still done by women. So, summarising what's happened to each of the industries listed below since the 1980s. Well, primary industries have nearly halved. I've started you off with that. We went from over 250,000 people employed in coal mining in 1970 to only 4,000 by 2015. So the coal mining is still there, but very, very, very few people employed by comparison. Our secondary industry should also have declined. Our tertiary industry should have grown, and our quaternary industry should have grown. Now, you need to add figures for those, please. They are on page 170. Down here then, adding labels to the Dominos Effect diagram to show how all four industries in the northeast are linked and the effect when each domino falls, okay? So what we're kind of saying is, if overseas competition means that you don't employ people anymore, okay, then when people become unemployed, they no longer have money to go out and buy things in restaurants, to say go out for a meal. They don't have money to go and spend in clothes shopping. They don't have money to, do all the extra things that they would like to do. But that has a knock-on impact. Just like one domino falling over, hitting the next one, what we've got is when the coal industry declines, That leads to the industries that rely on it, say for instance the steel industry, also declining because they don't have a cheap and easy supply of coal anymore. Well, then the engineering industry, which relied on the steel industry, is now also declining. And if engineering goes down, then the people who build ships don't have necessarily the people with the right skills and knowledge, and so the shipbuilding industry declines. And then eventually all of these people from coal, steel, engineering and shipbuilding, all out of work without that disposable income to be able to spend in their high street shops and restaurants, bars, cafes, hairdressers. Eventually, those shops also go out of business as well. This is what we might consider a spiral of decline, and it's almost the opposite of the multiplier effect, which you may have heard of if you do business studies. So, thinking about the present day then, why is it difficult to attract service industries to Dinnington and other parts of northern England? Well, let's have a think about what some of those service industries are. If people don't have highly paid employment, are they likely to be going out to loads of bars and restaurants and to going to the cinema and going to the theatre? Probably not. If you wanted to attract services that rely on other people having income, then it is really, really difficult to do that when people are on average low paid. So our next page of our homework, the rise of the UK's new economy. So what kinds of industries are employing people in London? There should be evidence to support all of these points. So I start you off with ICT. So there's an IT industry, a huge IT industry, and no doubt that is growing even now as we all move online for our work and our study. Particularly the IT industry is diverse. It isn't just managing the financial system, although that is an important aspect of it, but it is also, managing things like marketing, filmmaking, video shoots, all of those sorts of things as well. Okay, and every single business, even every school, still will have somebody in an IT department to help us with all the technology that we seem to use in our sort of daily lives now. So you could have had loads of examples in here. The one I've given you is IT. Equally, you could have had financial services, you could have had marketing and advertising, you could have had film and TV making, you could have had fashion, you could have had lots and lots of different things, okay? This question up here then, which industries are associated with the knowledge economy? Right at the beginning of this lesson, I mentioned the knowledge economy to you. I said it was often part of the tertiary sector, the service sector, but not necessarily. It could be also part of the quaternary sector. What's important about the knowledge economy is that we are making money off what we know, not necessarily off what we can make or give you. Okay, so it's an intangible part of the economy. For instance, a bank, yes, it stores people's money, but most of that money is stored digitally. So really all it's doing is adding up what everybody has. The services that it offers are not physical things. Okay, so banks are part of the knowledge economy. Education is a big part of the knowledge economy. Maybe London's universities, many, many famous universities, not just London, but also the southeast of England has amongst the UK's best universities, whether we're talking about Oxford and Cambridge, UCL, King's, Southampton, lots and lots of different universities. And you'd be surprised at how much money our universities make. In particular, overseas students bring with them or pay a huge amount of money to the university to be able to study here in the UK, and that is an important source of income for the university, which of course then employs other people in the local area, whether that's keeping cafes and restaurants and bars open, whether that is providing cleaning service or requiring cleaning services, whether that's requiring librarian services, that is hiring buildings and paying rents, loads and loads of different things that the universities might contribute to the urban area that they're in. The rural economy, however, has also changed in the UK. Okay, it may still produce a large amount of certain products, particularly things like dairy products, wheat, pork, and beef. Okay, so meat and dairy products and quite a few cereal products are still produced very heavily in the UK. Agriculture has not disappeared, it just employs less people. But that doesn't mean that it isn't still booming. And in addition to the agriculture, which is the traditional rural economy, the new rural economy looks at things like tourism. Okay, huge numbers of people use the natural scenery of our rural areas to promote those areas and also to attract people to come and spend money in those places. Whether you're going for a hike, you're going down to the beach in Cornwall, you're going to hire a holiday home or a caravan somewhere, you're going to enjoy the UK's natural landscape, okay? The disadvantages, of course, of the new rural economy is that it's very difficult to work, perhaps isolation. You guys understand this now, I'm sure, not just from your work colleagues, but also from your friends. That distance is really, really difficult to deal with. So I talked to you about a spiral of decline when we were talking about the declining primary and secondary industries in the UK, the UK's old economy. And I said to you then that it was the opposite of the multiplier effect. Now, this little diagram here is the multiplier effect, okay? And the idea is that it goes in a spiral upwards. So I hope that that is quite clear to you. It's a spiral that moves upwards. And that spiral is important. It shows us how one investment can lead to the growth of multiple industries. So say, for instance, we invest in something, say, for instance, the BBC moving to Manchester. That huge amount of money going into Manchester leads to the growth of that industry. And that means that in Manchester, they need to hire more people. They need to hire and increase that workforce of people who are going to work at the BBC, whether that's production and design, makeup artists, all the rest. That means that more people are going to move there. They're moving there for that industry, for those jobs. Those people moving there need loads of stuff. They need houses, they need services, they need water, they need schools, they need shops and restaurants and hairdressers and everybody else. And all of those other businesses then need to hire other workers as well, who are all going to say, for instance, need food. And that means that more shops are going to open, more services are provided. And again, that leads to greater demand for workers. And at each stage of this multiplier effect, we get an increase in overall wealth. People's incomes, their employment rates go up. So, can you add to this diagram of the multiplier effect to show why there are more jobs and more wealth in the southeast of England? And you've got to particularly think about what kinds of industries did we mention before, okay? What kinds of industries have been successful or pay people high wages? And also about the fact that we talked about government investment, okay? So government investment are, government payments into certain things that promote those industries. Finally then, explaining the benefits that companies in the southeast of England might get from moving to the northeast of England. There's a big push on this to actually start to spread out the UK's wealth and industries just from the southeast. Why should they all be based down here? Okay, well, one of the big advantages is lower wages. People in the northeast have lower living costs and therefore will accept lower wages for doing the same work. Well, if that's the case, that might reduce costs for a company significantly enough to give up their very expensive London headquarters and maybe move to the northeast of England. It could also reduce the rent costs for the amount of space. And so, when we were looking before at some of the industries that are in the northeast, we said, for instance, that there are a lot of manufacturing still. Car manufacturing takes up a huge amount of space. And the rent cost for that land is going to be really, really high. Don't forget that you still have another homework to do. I'd like you to read pages 172 and 175 of the textbook using Caboodle and complete the two tables on London's significant at various scales and the structure of the city. So this is something called the Burgess model. It tells you a little bit about what different areas of the city look like. This is something that you should be able to do from both the textbook and from your own experience. What big differences are there between the centre of London and the areas that we live in the suburbs, and further out, if you sort of sat on the Met Line and you went further out of the city, what would change about the characteristics of each area, what kind of houses people have, what kind of land use you get, how tall the buildings are, all of those things. So this homework is due next lesson in lesson 5. See you then.